Welcome to the Autonomic Healing Podcast. I'm Tom Pells.
And I'm Ruth Lawrenson. We'll be unpacking what it looks like to activate your brain to holistically manage stress and trauma that bring healing to the mind, body, and spirit.
Being free to live authentically as humans.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started. Hey Tom, we're here and we want to do this final episode on rational intimacy. Obviously we'll be talking about rational intimacy throughout all of the episodes because it's incredibly instrumental to live in homeostasis.
Yeah.
But what I mean is that this is at least the last part of this mini series that we've created on rational intimacy, which has been so amazing to do. This whole other paradigm of living, a way in which we can live in an intimate way with ourselves and others in a healthy way, right? Mm-hmm. And so just as a little recap, we've talked about, in the first episodes in this mini-series, we talked about those stages of rational intimacy and the core strengths that were applied in those spaces. And then we looked at the importance of beneficial versus detrimental, the choices we make and how in rational intimacy, we need to look at what is beneficial. It's like a really big filter to make those choices. And in our last episode, which I loved, by the way, we looked at the difference between reaction and response. It's so good. If you're catching us right now and you haven't listened to any of the previous episodes, just really encourage you at least to go back a few just to start with those rational intimacy first episodes. But today what we're going to look at is how do we get to love others and treat others well? And it all stems from being able to love ourselves well. So Tom, can you kick us off with that thought?
Love your neighbor as yourself. With its mirror image, the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated. Every major religion has that as a core belief. As a child, my family brought me to church Sunday morning and evening, and then for years to a midweek catechism. And I remember every Sunday morning, the 10 Commandments were read out from the 1959 Psalter hymnal I'm holding in my hand.
So you just went and got that, right?
I did.
So you've got this, so it was written in 1959.
This hymnal was produced in 1959. I was born in 56. Not to date myself, but I just did.
I love old books, and so this is a treat having this in your hand, but this is what you read and
Yep.
repeated.
And it was the 10 Commandments in that service, and the pastor would start and the congregation would respond, and the pastor would say, God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who has brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before my face. You shall make for yourself no idol in the likeness of anything in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. Congregational response, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And then when you got down to a later commandment, you shall not murder.
That's a big one.
That's a big one. Frequently violated. But the congregational response to you shall not murder was you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Whosoever hateth his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer hath eternal life abiding in him. And I was a little boy, and I believe God is love. And here I was, the 10 Commandments, every Sunday morning. You shall.
Yeah, and it's a pretty heavy-duty thing.
You think? Oh, yeah. As I say, though, every major religion has this as a core belief. The Buddha, whatever is disagreeable to yourself, do not do unto others. Confucius, do not do to others what you do not want them to do to you. The Prophet Muhammad, none of you has faith until he loves for his brother or his neighbor what he loves for himself. And as I just read, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. And I can't tell you how many times the idea of loving ourselves has come up in sessions with clients. Mm. Of course, it frequently came up in conversations when I was a minister. Mm. And for the majority of people, it actually came as a revelation that loving ourselves was inherently being advocated in love your neighbor as yourself and treat others the way you want to be treated. And it came as a revelation to me along the way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a couple of things there, I think, that, within that command, which feels, incredibly important. And I think it's really interesting that it's in all of those religions. Mm-hmm. And I think partly because there's something in our wiring, right? To
as a human being.
To be loving each other, our neighbours. So I think that there's that in the mix, but there's something that's been lost in translation along the way, which a big piece of that, which is like ourselves. So how can we love our neighbours if we don't focus on ourselves? But before we go there, I want to just really quickly define, the neighbour part, because it's something that it's a word that can have different connotations or meanings that are different, depending on what culture you've come from.
Oh yeah.
And I know that in Christianity, what we see is Jesus really tries to. A lot of his teaching is to blow that idea up. I think when I think about some of Jesus' teaching on neighbour, I think of him going, well, you think it means this, but how about let's blow that idea up, and how about it means a neighbour is someone who's right in front of you. And I think it's important just to clarify it before we go on, because if for our listeners, I think we can think and listen to this stuff and think of it on an intellectual level, but I think this is so important to think about, where am I at right now?
Yeah.
Who are my neighbours? When we're talking about loving our neighbours as ourselves today in this episode, I would just love, I'm thinking through, well, what does this mean for my life? Yeah. I'm sure you are too. And I'd really encourage listeners to be thinking through, well, what does this actually mean? Who are my neighbours? Who are the people who are in front of me? But I'm just curious if you've got any definitions on neighbour or...
Classically, the definition of neighbor is a person living near or next door.
Yes.
To whoever is saying that.
That Aussie soap series.
Yes, which has all sorts of implications for who am I living near, who do I want to be living near, and all the rest of that. And for many people, neighbor is defined functionally as someone who's like me.
That's so true. Yeah.
And yet neighbor is not someone who's like me. Mm-hmm. Unless I'm isolated in some pocket of everybody is like me. That's not neighbor. Neighbor is whoever is near me. That's how I think of it.
Yeah.
Who am I near? Depending on if I'm here in Colorado or I'm visiting my son, and in Washington, D.C., neighbor looks real different. Mm-hmm.
So the people who are...
nearby.
Nearby.
Whoever that is, whatever they're like.
Yeah.
That's neighbor. Mm-hmm. That can get real uncomfortable for many people, though, because they don't like their neighbors and they don't want to be neighbors with. But every major religion says, love your neighbor.
So talk a little bit about how we can do this. Like you said, we've got this giant, I love your old hymn bit there. It can seem so full of religion to have that command, but actually I think deep down, like we said, there is this wiring in us as human beings to love each other well, the people nearby us well. So
what happens if we don't?
And what happens if we don't?
Is a lot of what we're living with right now.
And part of rational intimacy, right, is to be able to do this well. So talk a little bit about that.
Rational intimacy is not just about relationship with others. It is primarily about relationship with ourselves. I can appreciate how contrary this is to the traditional conceptions of intimacy, since there are so many ways that intimacy with self can be compromised, creating a caricature of love itself. That the idea of love for self, or dare I even utter that phrase, self-love, is met with skepticism, if not outright disagreement.
Yeah. I think when I think of self-love, it's funny just saying it, isn't it? Self-love. It's just like, it feels like, oh my gosh, stop thinking about yourself, Ruth, so much.
That's wrong.
But I think there's a confusing message here around this topic, right?
And not just in our own culture.
Around the world.
In cultures around the world.
Yeah.
Yes.
And in religious circles too.
Particularly.
So we've got this, I think that the intention is good to love other people, but we skip the loving ourselves.
Yeah, because that seems nice.
Uh-huh.
That's a nice person who loves others and loves their neighbor.
Yeah, and when I think about, what we're talking about with loving ourselves or self-love, it actually makes me feel really uncomfortable. Because I think there are so many layers to this. I think it can be looked down upon. It can be misunderstood as egotism. And honestly, Tom, I don't think that there are actually many good examples of what a healthy way to love yourself looks like. Either we completely ignore it and don't do that and try and love our neighbours without loving ourselves, or we're in fear of the egotism or the narcissism or all of the traps, I guess, you could fall into if you're doing something in a way that's not healthy,
Yeah.
So just want to throw that back out to you again, but I just want to agree with you, because I think that there is this kind of what we're talking about, loving ourselves.
That's no good. Yeah. And the whole idea of sacrificial love is love that is a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
But authentic love is not sacrificial that way. It is a sacrifice, but it is a giving, a generous sharing of self with others, and that it doesn't feel sacrificial.
Yeah, so the fact that if we're trying to love our neighbours, people who are near us, sacrificially, if we ignore loving ourselves authentically, then and correct me if I'm wrong, but the best way we'll end up loving other people is in a superficial way.
Of course.
If we don't actually love ourselves.
Yep.
So we'll call it sacrificial. We'll try and do the sacrificial thing.
And it will be sacrificial, but it won't be living.
But if there is something about understanding who we are, loving ourselves, starting in that place, then out of that place, we have an ability, a chance to genuinely love the people around us.
Yes. So if you think back to the tsunami of stress, which if you're just listening to this and you haven't listened to that, that's why that would be valuable to listen to the episode on the tsunami of stress and the core issues that are a part of that. That with stress and need, the core issues with that are inadequacy and insecurity. Is that loving?
No.
Inadequacy and insecurity? Is it loving to even communicate a sense to someone that they are insecure and inadequate? No.
No.
And then that inadequacy and insecurity grows into a sense of powerless. And is love powerless? No. If anything, that's empowering. And then the inadequacy and insecurity and the powerlessness grows into a lack of control. And is love about control in the first place? No. And then poor self-image and low self-esteem. What parent who is genuinely loving to their child communicates poor self-image, low self-esteem. We may wind up, but it's not loving.
It's not what love in its origin is. Now, when we experience, I mean, what you're talking through there are those stages of the tsunami of stress, inadequacy, insecurity, powerlessness, lack of control, poor image, low self-esteem, and these are the effects of stress and trauma that erode what is originally love, right?
Right.
But I think what you're saying there is to say, well, actually, hang on a minute. If these things are present, then, they're not indicative of love.
No. And if you think about those core issues, then loving, air quotes, ourselves, that's why it's often thought of as vanity and selfishness and synonymous with conceitedness and egotism and narcissism, because those core issues are being masked. They're being covered up. And with a lack of, those actually are a lack of love for self that is rooted in the core issues that we just talked about.
And so the fear of, in some ways, the fear of loving ourselves, because actually maybe then we'll become, conceited, or maybe that's selfish. Actually, it's just it's like in some ways, it's like a scale. We either completely don't love ourselves at one end of the scale, or the right far at the other end is not love either, which is, the egotism, the selfishness. But we're not talking about that.
No.
And there is another way to love ourselves well without falling into that space.
With rational intimacy, the natural, organic progression of actually rational perceptions, which we'll get into more in upcoming episodes, of self and others as individual as well as collective. Individual and neighbor, so to speak. Individual and collective, individual and neighbor. As I laid out and said in the first of our episodes on rational intimacy, with homeostasis restored and the reactivity to stress and trauma triggers being able to be managed, a very different sort of intimacy can be experienced with self and others. I went on to say the pattern of relationship with self and others, where homeostasis is the norm, is what I call rational intimacy. So rather than a repeated experience of successive waves of the tsunami of stress and the unhealthy, dysfunctional intimacy, there is a healthy, functional experience.
Yes. And it's because of those, if you're in the tsunami of stress and the constant triggers of the flight and fight experience, it's like almost you don't have a chance, right, for rational intimacy, because you're spending all the energy on, swimming underwater or whatever
and trying to breathe.
So by going through autonomic healing and activating homeostasis and normalizing our body's response to stress, we actually have this. We enter into this place of poise where we can kind of breathe and begin to make those choices into rational intimacy. Is that right?
Yep. And remember, we're body, mind, and spirit. And it's not just somatic homeostasis. It's cognitive homeostasis and spiritual homeostasis. But the unhealthy, dysfunctional intimacy and the tsunami of stress is very intimate. The unhealthy, dysfunctional intimacy that we experience in the tsunami of stress invariably causes us to harm ourselves and others. The antithesis of loving your neighbor as yourself. As we seek to just feel good about ourselves, but that's not actually loving ourselves. That's just feeling good. And that's why so often our efforts to just feel good are choices that we make that do harmful things to ourselves and others. And that inhibits loving self and others. So the first stage in rational intimacy is contentment. And remember, contentment is a sense of satisfaction and well-being. In other words, homeostasis, which may or may not include a sense of happiness. So with contentment, things may be sunny and peaceful or stormy and chaotic, but with homeostasis, we can be loving and manage a response rather than a reaction. The core strength that begins to emerge with contentment is feeling secure and capable. That sounds a lot like love. Mm-hmm. Secure and capable, love and loving. Yeah. That sense of security and capability means that we can love ourselves and our neighbors as ourselves. We can take the healthy risks of loving. We may even pull off loving our enemies. And that's what homeostasis makes possible. It is the lack of homeostasis that energizes the tsunami of stress and inevitably leads to just wanting to feel good, but that's at the expense of well-being, both our own and others. It's the lack of homeostasis that is the root of the majority of health issues. To indulge myself in a bit of neuroscience, this is what underlies AHA, let me share something that I include in forensic mental health assessments when I do them. Researchers have found that the impact of stress on decision-making, including risk aversion, like risk aversion to love, and engaging in antisocial behavior, increases after a stressful event. This conflicts with previous research, which suggested a more constant effect across time. They also found that stressed individuals fixated on themselves and ignored the negative consequences of their choices to others. These findings highlight the complex impacts of stress on decision-making. The authors went on, and this is from the European Journal of Neuroscience, acute stress alters individual risk-taking in a time-dependent manner and leads to antisocial risk.
Wow. That's so important, isn't it, then? Because actually part of what we've talked about with rational intimacy is that we need to be able to make good decisions. We need to be able to make decisions that are beneficial, not detrimental. And we've got to make decisions, or at least catch ourselves if we're reacting to something and choose then to respond to something. But what that is saying is that if we're in this kind of tsunami of stress,
homeostasis,
then it's going to have a massive impact on our ability to even make those decisions.
Yep. And then we're not going to be loving to ourselves, let alone to our neighbors. So in contrast to that, and this is from George Billman, an article, The Underappreciated and Far Too Often Ignored Central Organizing Principle of Physiology. Homeostasis, as currently defined, is the self-regulating process by which biological systems, and human beings are biological systems, maintain stability while adjusting to changing external conditions. This concept explains how an organism can maintain more or less constant internal conditions, and love is an internal condition, that allow it to adapt and to survive in the face of a changing and often hostile external environment. Our awareness of homeostasis has slowly emerged over the centuries and has become the central organizing tenet of physiology. If one does not understand this self-regulating process, then it is not possible to comprehend fully the function of the body in health and in disease. The disruption of homeostatic mechanisms is what leads to disease, and effective therapy must be directed toward reestablishing these homeostatic conditions, working with rather than against nature.
Wow. I just think that's absolutely fascinating, especially when you think about, disease and when you think of someone being in. So it's basically saying that homeostasis prevents or keeps us safe from disease, right?
Yes.
But there are times where we won't be in homeostasis in emergencies, which is what our body
Of course.
is designed to do. But if we are in that perpetual state of fight and flight, then our defenses are so low all the time.
Yep.
So we need to get back into homeostasis.
Medical and mental health.
Wow.
And a lack of or the presence of homeostasis.
Mm-hmm.
That's why AHA. Problem solving for cognitive, spiritual formation for the spiritual, and AHA for the somatic homeostasis. So, diving into the deep water, at the risk of trying to define something as undefinable as love, and gentle listeners, please be patient with me, but I'm going to dive in.
I'll post it on Instagram, Tom.
Thanks, Ruth. Allow me to offer the following related to a definition of love that's operational for me. I think of love as compassionate intimacy that is rationally beneficial. Compassionate intimacy that is rationally beneficial. Now, that doesn't have the ambiance of some really flowery love language, but I think it gets at it. Mm-hmm. So love as compassionate intimacy that is rationally beneficial, if we take that apart, there's compassion, which is sympathy, which is feeling, which is empathy, which is understanding, which is care and concern. Solicitous, sensitive, tender-hearted, soft-hearted, warm-hearted, warm, love, tenderness, gentleness. How about mercy? Being merciful, lenient, tolerant, considerate, kind. Humanity, charity, benevolence. Those are all the words that are synonyms for compassion. That's why I chose compassion, because it covers a wide, broad waterfront. As opposed to indifference and heartlessness, which kind of don't sound like they are related to love. And compassionate intimacy. And intimacy is close familiarity or friendship, closeness. The intimacy, for instance, between a husband and a wife, or a person and their friend, a parent with their child. Synonyms for intimacy: closeness, togetherness, affinity, rapport, familiarity, close association, close relationship, close attachment, friendship, friendliness, companionship, mutual affection, fellow feeling. I think it's a British one. Chumminess. Mateiness.
That's definitely British.
There you go. So intimacy. And then rationally. To do the compassion and intimacy rationally. Be reasonable, or, and I'm tentative on this one, logical. And the reason I'm tentative on the logical part is because the critical factor in rationality is the tendency for human beings to be what I call seemingly rational. It makes sense to us. In other words, the distortion of perceptions of self and others that is completely understandable because of stress and trauma is persuasive and compelling and seems rational to us, but is not in reality actually rational. It's kind of like the difference between true versus truth. When I testify as an expert witness in a court of law, they don't swear me in to say what's true. They swear me in to tell the truth, because we can say something is true and add to or leave out, and then it isn't the truth anymore. And then it's not actually rational. And then beneficial. Favorable or advantageous, resulting in some beneficial effect. So synonyms for beneficial: advantageous, favorable, helpful, useful, benefit, assist, service, instrumental, valuable, in someone's interests, best interests, worthwhile, good, positive, profitable, rewarding, productive, promising, beneficial. So that sounds like love to me. Compassionate intimacy that is rationally beneficial.
Well done.
Thank you.
That's better than I could come up with, that's for sure. But I do love it, Tom, because there is something about it that, like I said earlier, I think not only do we have a culture where it's so confusing what love is, but we don't have a good model. We don't know what it looks like to see love through a lens, a healthy lens. And so when you say all of that stuff, those 4 words, I think that it's just a really, I mean, just to start with ourselves, I think, am I loving myself? Am I being compassionate to myself? Am I being intimate with myself? Is the way I'm treating myself rational? And is it beneficial? I think they're incredibly good filters, not only for ourselves, but then eventually others too.
Yes. So, as I like to put it, loving your neighbor as yourself is about loving people. Who's going to disagree with that? It's about loving people. And as an individual, I'm a people. And I found that helpful because it takes a bit of just put some distance in or take some stigma away from loving self.
Like being selfish.
Right.
Yeah.
Or conceited or self-centered or self-focused. For me, when I think about it, loving people, yeah, let's do that. Let's love people. Oh, and I'm a people. So I can love me because I'm a people. So I love people. I happen to be one. And you're a people. And I can love you. So let's love people.
I think that's so helpful because I think it just takes, it gives us permission, doesn't it? It gives us the permission that's already there because we are human beings that are wired to love. But to love in a healthy way is to love people, including ourselves. I'm a people. I like that.
And one of the wonderful things that happens out of that is that then the commandment becomes a natural and understandable anticipation. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Becomes, you will. You will love your neighbor as yourself. You shall do that.
And so I wonder whether there's just something here that, I think, again, if we can just understand there's something organically built into who we are as human beings, that we're created to love.
Yeah.
And so I think if we avoid the egotism, which isn't self-love,
which
either,
is the absence of
love
for self.
If we actually ditch let's look like we're being really loving, but we're really not loving ourselves.
And that's people pleasing.
Yeah, exactly. People pleasing, everyone else but us. And somehow, if we can find ourselves in the middle, where we go, okay, we're human beings. We're called to love. There's something in us that's to love people, and that includes me. And so, if we end up loving ourselves, something naturally occurs, right?
Yep.
Something organically.
Yes, because we're doing that with ourselves, we naturally do that with others. And if we're not doing it with ourselves, we're not going to be doing it with others. The example that I love, pardon the pun, to use is the flight attendant instructions about the use of the oxygen mask in an emergency. That's love your neighbor as yourself. Put your own on first and then assist others. Talk about loving your neighbor as yourself and treating others as you would like to be treated, especially when it's an emergency and you can't breathe. Let's all breathe, shall we? If we don't put our own mask on, we can't breathe long enough to help our neighbor on the flight of this journey of living to breathe as well, can we? And wouldn't we like our neighbor to do that for us if we weren't breathing?
Yeah.
and gasping for air.
So this is a huge part of rational intimacy, to begin with loving ourselves, right? Put our oxygen mask on. I think, one of the things that I'm aware of is not only are there very few models that seem to teach us this, not only culturally is it looked down on, but I think then,
stigmatized.
It's stigmatized, but also story and trauma and the way life has brought some of that stuff into people's lives has a massive impact on how we love ourselves. So we have to embrace that, right?
Yep.
To go, actually, this is an important thing. Which is why I think a lot of people, are going into therapy and are spending time on understanding. Actually, I know that I was listening to someone the other day who said, in terms of like bringing up your children, one of the best things you can do is actually understand your own story, which is the oxygen mask again.
Yep.
It's self-care. Like, I know that we're going to go into some of that as we go on, but I'm just curious if you've got anything to say on that, in terms of the stress and trauma, dealing with our stories. And
it's why we don't love ourselves or our neighbors. Our seemingly rational perceptions that lead us into that tsunami of stress are why we can't breathe. And oxygen is kind of important for human life. And love is the oxygen of intimacy. And if we can't breathe, that's going to have an impact.
Yeah.
And just create more stress. It's our perceptions that are not actually rational.
That
compound. Yes.
They come out of those places of stress and trauma. So the way we view things are skewed in some ways, right?
Yep. And we may or may not even know it.
Yeah. So
because to us, it seems rational. See, that's why I don't talk about irrationality. I talk about seeming rationality.
Yes.
Because oftentimes it's not obviously and overtly irrational.
Yeah, and no one's going to go around...
It's completely understandable to think that way.
And no one's going to go around thinking, I'm really irrational.
No. Although at times we certainly can be, and my hand is up for yes.
But most of the time we think we're being rational.
Right. And then we're being logical. We're logically reasoning things out, but if our perceptions aren't actually rational to start with, then our logic is flawed.
And so with things like what I've just mentioned with story and stress and trauma, and, we've got all sorts of stuff in the mix there that people will be carrying. From those places, there's work to be done to identify what those seemingly rational perceptions are, how we're viewing the world, how we're viewing other people that come from those places of stress and trauma, and then how to look at how they're actually rational, right?
Yep. And then we can love. We can have that compassionate intimacy that is rationally beneficial for people. I'm a people. You're a people. We're all people.
And Tom, I'm excited about, because what we're going to be going into now are some of these perceptions.
Yep.
And it's such a big part of all of this. We haven't even, we've kind of, we've mentioned them a few times, but never really dove into them in this podcast yet. But we're going to be entering into that space of.
Yep. And the perceptions are how we can personally identify with the tsunami of stress and rational intimacy. It's like the tsunami of stress and rational intimacy are the vehicles, but it's the customized vehicle. It's our own vehicle.
Yes.
That's what the perceptions allow for.
Yeah.
The general thing to be individualized.
Well, I can't wait for that. So guys, stay tuned. We've got upcoming episodes on autonomic healing activation. It's actually what we're looking at is the problem solving, the cognitive homeostasis, where we see and look at how those perceptions, those seemingly rational perceptions, can become actual rational perceptions.
Yep.
Stay tuned. We'll see you at the next one.
You've been listening to the Autonomic Healing Podcast.
Join us next time as we continue in our conversations with Tom. If you're interested in pursuing your own autonomic healing journey and want to find a practitioner, visit our website, innerworkings.org. See you at the next episode.